hearing from Chad Gilchrist, who is the GSA Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Portfolio Management. GSA has, not to be outdone by the Army, has 360 million square feet of space and 8,000 buildings. And Chad comes to the GSA from U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, where he was dealing with facility life cycle and dealing with the 30 million square feet. He has 20 years of government policy making. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I like lawyers. He's a graduate from the Maryland School of Law. So please welcome Chad Gilchrist.
We usually don't mention that last part, but thank you, Mike. So Chris had the coveted spot right after lunch. I have the coveted spot right before break. It's really a privilege to be here. Want to speak a little bit about what GSA has been doing to operationalize that tremendous body knowledge that was presented this morning from the GAO reports, from the vast amount of work that the Federal Facilities Council and the National Academies have done. So I want to provide a glimpse first of our portfolio, and then some of the work that we've been doing coming out of the pandemic to operationalize principles of asset management. There we go. So the Public Building Service has, as Mike mentioned, over 8,000 buildings. About 1,600 of those are owned. The remainder, the Delta, are leased. That's more than 360 million square feet of space across the country in 2,200 communities. 10 million individuals visit GSA properties every single year, whether those individuals are pursuing justice through the courts, applying for, receiving Social Security benefits in SSA facilities, entering or leaving the country through land ports of entry, or trillions of dollars that are entering the country through land ports of entry, scientists who are working in laboratories, highly specialized space, working to cure cancer, or doing forensic law enforcement work. It's a very diverse and varied portfolio. GSA is also the holder of the biggest civilian real estate in the country, and probably actually one of the top, if not the top, civilian real estate holders in the world, housing 1 million federal employees here in those 2,200 communities nationwide. I'm going to jump to the next slide, which talks a little bit about how we fund or finance that work of the over 8,000 facilities throughout the country. I'm going to try to avoid being controversial. In 1972, Congress had a great idea. Congress had a great idea to finance or fund real estate activities of the federal government in a centralized and predictable way. That idea was the Federal Buildings Fund. The Federal Buildings Fund is capitalized by rent dollars that PBS, the Public Building Service, collects and deposits those collections into the fund. We collect them from our tenant agencies, our partner federal agencies who are performing their missions in that space across the country. Those collections add up to about $11 billion annually. That's enough. That's enough money to fund the work, the reinvestment needs. You can see all the buckets at the bottom, whether it's repairs and alterations, construction and acquisition, rental of space, the monies that we pay back out to our commercial lease obligations for those over 6,000 leases. Building operations, paying the utilities, keeping the lights on, doing the janitorial work, predictive maintenance and all the like. And then, salaries for me and my colleagues within the Public Building Service. $11 billion is enough to reinvest into the inventory and sustain it. The challenge is the construct, the framework has not been applied in keeping with that original idea from Congress. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But over the last decade or 15 years, PBS has not given new obligational authority, has not been given access to those dollars that it collects in order to reinvest those dollars into the facilities. And on average, over the last decade, Congress has short funded PBS by over $1 billion on average, which means that about 87 cents on the dollar, we're able to reinvest into the inventory. Even that paints an inaccurate picture of really what's going on, because about half of those dollars have to go right back out the door to satisfy commercial lease obligations. It's about $5.5 billion worth of the $11 billion in collections goes to fund rental of space, paying for commercially leased space. Which means that $1 billion or so, $1.5 billion of underfunding comes primarily out of one or two buckets. The biggest bucket being repairs and alterations. Really comes out of construction, acquisition, repairs and alterations. What we know, and it was mentioned earlier today, we've got sort of this golden rule that the Federal Facilities Council has helped us with, this community. We should be spending 2 to 4% of functional replacement value or plant replacement value annually on the inventory. In PBS's world, and I'm just going to use big broad brushstrokes and averages, that means we should be spending about $2 to $4 billion annually in reinvestment into the inventory. The only bucket of money that looks anything like discretionary to Congress in all of these budget activities is the repairs and alterations account and the new construction and acquisition. So I'll again lump those together. GSA as an organization is pretty lean on overhead in terms of salaries compared to other federal government agencies. And as was mentioned, I'm a recovering customer. I was at Customs and Border Protection for 14 years and with GSA for the last coming on 6. That means that $1 billion or $1.5 billion in underfunding comes right out of these areas. And instead of spending, if we're just going to use the low side of the equation, instead of reinvesting $2 billion annually, we're reinvesting $500 million or $1 billion annually. So you can underfund an agency, and I think any agency would be familiar with being underfunded by about 10% or getting a 10% haircut on its budget request. That doesn't sort of smack the conscience. But when you look at where the $1 billion is coming out of, it's more like a 50% cut. It sometimes approaches an 80% cut based on the needs that are emerging at a time. And when you do that for 10 or 15 years or more, we really are living. There was a great quote in one of the earlier documents that was up on the slide, I think when Jack was speaking. One of the quotes that struck me the first time I read it and has kept with me since is something along the lines of, given this construct, the way that we are operating collectively in the federal space, is that we are spending our inheritance and wasting our assets. That's what's happening when we're underfunding capital reinvestment needs by about half, year in and year out. So we know, and great presentations earlier today that sort of helped set the foundation of some of the work that GSA has been doing. We have too much space. There's more space than we need in the federal enterprise that PBS is responsible for. More space than is necessary. It's in the wrong configuration. It's in the wrong condition. It's on average 50 years old since its last major modernization or reinvestment. Those trends were true pre-pandemic, and they've been accelerated post-pandemic. We know that through the work of the Federal Real Property Council, we've focused as a federal enterprise on freezing the footprint and reducing the footprint. GSA has made great strides in doing just that. GSA came off of the high-risk list for leasing that Mike and Matt mentioned earlier and that Amelia mentioned earlier. We came off of that list because of our reduced reliance on expensive leasing. We still have a tremendous challenge, though, given the trends that have accelerated post-pandemic on utilization of space and what that means for the mix of owned and leased assets. So in the last 2 years, emerging from the pandemic, GSA has acted in a concerted way to sort of re-wed ourselves to the principles of asset management, analyzing the entire inventory of owned assets against the characteristics of condition, utilization, financial performance, and cost to house alternatives. So there's a lot wrapped up in that. But what it means, to borrow a phrase from Roger earlier, just a few moments ago, he said, not all installations are created equal, not all assets are created equal. So we've got 1,600 owned assets. Some of those assets are high performers financially. They produce a lot of revenue. They've got low liabilities or deferred maintenance and repairs and low renewal investment needs. They've got very low degrees of vacancy, and they're well meeting mission requirements. That's a very minority of our asset, of our candidates. You've got the flip side of that as well. And you've got assets that have higher degrees of vacancy or underutilization, high degrees of deferred maintenance and liabilities and reinvestment needs, and potentially with requirements that are better housed in a lease environment. And oftentimes, PBS and GSA is asked, what's the appropriate mix of leased to owned space? What's that right ratio? The right ratio is really an asset by asset consideration that sort of stacks up to your portfolio level view. If you have an asset that has $300 million worth of renewal needs or reinvestment needs, deferred liabilities, deferred maintenance and liabilities and others, and it's 80% occupied, if 20% of that space is vacant or underutilized, and if you can lease in that market for $15 or $17 a square foot, and it's just general purpose office space, it's easily replicable by the commercial or private sector, that's a great candidate to be housed in lease space. On the flip side of that, if you've got an asset that has a very specific mission-driven requirement that is built out for special law enforcement space, special law enforcement mission characteristics or laboratory requirements or courthouses or ports of entry, those are great candidates, especially if they're in expensive markets, to be federally owned and in the custody and control of the government in perpetuity. So we wanted to analyze the entire inventory so that we could sort of rack and stack, segment the inventory, and know the difference between our core assets, our long-term holds, and those assets that were on the other end of the spectrum, that were either more likely disposition candidates or candidates that could find a higher and better use under a different purpose than serving general government requirements. And there was a real opportunity and a recognition in this process that because we as GSA are the largest civilian holders of general purpose office space, that office space was the real opportunity. So I'm not going to speak today too much about land ports of entry or courthouses. Land ports of entry were fortunate enough to receive over $3 billion worth of investment in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and GSA is working in partnership with CBP to implement those projects. Something that was near and dear to my heart because worked very diligently on the asset management framework within CBP to build the credibility and the premise for reinvestment in those assets that were just like all of GSA's assets by and large at the time, 40 years old and designed under an era where CBP's mission didn't even exist, let alone the mission of the ports of entry today. But the real opportunity to move the needle today is in general purpose office space. Office space that we know across the federal enterprise was underutilized pre-pandemic to the tune of 30 or 40%. 6 or 7 seats out of 10 were filled pre-pandemic based on what we know from customer intelligence and feedback from customers and other data sources. And what we know from the work of GAO and the work of the federal partners in that recent study on CFO Act headquarter agencies is those numbers were turned on their heads. So instead of 6 or 7 seats out of 10 being occupied on average or peak average, it's the flip side. 3 or 4 are occupied if we're being really generous. And it's 6 or 7 seats that are empty in the CFO Act headquarter agencies buildings. Now, that means that we've got, again, reinforcement of this principle that we have more space than we need, but it also harkens back to something that Roger mentioned earlier about, it's that office over here and it's this floor over here. It's not this popular concept of there's just a big empty federal building that's waiting to be disposed of. It's Swiss cheese vacancy. It's a game of Tetris that we're trying to figure out how to rack and stack to appropriately optimize the inventory. And because of that, it takes money to save money. It takes investment dollars to get out of underutilized asset B into core asset A for a variety of reasons. One, for the very basic move and replication costs of getting out of building B into building A. but you also have to make sure that building A has an HVAC system that's functioning properly, that can appropriately handle that potential densification, a roof that doesn't leak, elevators that work, a building envelope that's sealed, and hopefully also that building is either now or on its way to being a high-performing federal building, meeting the characteristics of high efficiency and high sustainability asset. But because we're spread too thin, we lack the ability to really target the revenue that we do collect onto those core assets, again, to the principle that we've got more space than we need. So that was the start of this process that we did nationally, and we called it our national portfolio planning process. We provided sort of central office level data on those characteristics of condition, vacancy or utilization, performance, and cost to our regional practitioners, our experts who know those assets, customers, and markets best. So it's not, a series of central office professionals, working with a 3,000-mile screwdriver to trying to come up with solutions. It's practitioners in our regional offices throughout the country who, again, are versed in those individual assets, customers, and markets best to come up with a real-world view of the portfolio that is couched against customer intelligence. Customer intelligence that helps us complete the equation with the demand side of the equation. Most of the data that GSA or PBS has access to comes on the supply side of the equation. So there's a recognition that we need to marry that with the demand side of the equation, the agencies who are working out of these facilities to perform their missions. And then a recognition that this is not just a planning exercise for planning's sake, that the rubber meets the road at an execution phase and needs to be realized in annual budget submissions in our capital investment plans, our capital budget submissions. The projects that we prepare for disposition are the locations that are disposition candidates, and our lease optimization strategies. So where we invest, where we divest, and where we smartly lease. Smart leasing decisions, again, sort of going back to that discussion of net present value and what characteristics are appropriate for leased assets versus those that are appropriate for owned. So when we reinvest in core assets, when we dispose of underperforming assets, and when we smartly lease, the idea is that we're preserving revenue, that we're shedding liabilities, we're shedding those underperforming assets and the vacant space that does no one any good, whether it's agencies, GSA, the taxpayer, and we're applying the principles of optimization and modernization that hopefully results in fewer buildings and better buildings. And the question is, can you dispose your way there? Can you just dispose your way out of the challenge and not sort of wrestle with this investment side of the equation? Unfortunately, the math never pencils out without access to revenue. So without that money that it takes to save money downstream, PBS can't afford the consolidation projects that are necessary to get out of building A into building B. PBS can't modernize those facilities to make sure that the elevators are working and that the roofs aren't leaking and the HVAC systems are ready. And we can't produce that inventory that represents trends in the industry right now of a flight to quality. No one wants to collapse out of class C building B into class C building A. It's going to take some level of sort of attraction to a high-performing federal building that's going to meet mission requirements, that is going to be, again, breathing life into the principles of high-performance federal buildings, meaning that they're going to produce less waste, they're going to be less expensive to operate, facilities that PBS modernizes and meet those principles of high-performance federal buildings, beat their legacy counterparts in terms of O&M costs by 25%. They are 43% cheaper to operate than their commercial sector counterparts when they're optimized to PBS standards. The short version of that, though, again, harkens back to this principle of it takes money to save money, and we can't get out of building B and C into building A without the move and replication investment, those costs, and without making sure that building A can house them. So it's a real privilege to be able to speak as a career executive about some of these critical success factors, and I keep messing with the wrong button down here, which is to say, for years, PBS has sort of danced around this issue of full access to the Federal Buildings Fund. It's now a matter of, in the FY24 president's budget, a matter of a legislative proposal that was part of the president's budget in terms of full access to the Federal Buildings Fund, full access to those collections. And if PBS were to receive that full access, PBS isn't asking for an additional $1 billion to be appropriated. PBS is simply asking for, or PBS isn't even asking for the $10 billion that it's been shorted over the last decade, merely asking prospectively of Congress to be able to use the collections that are applied into the fund and reinvest them into the inventory. If we were able to do that, and if we were able to sort of use the trends that we've seen to date to reduce square footage, a 30% reduction in general purpose office space, for instance, would mean that we could save over $6 billion in downstream cost avoidance, $6 billion annually in snowballing deferred maintenance and repair renewal investment needs that have doubled over the last decade and are projected to double again. So right now the system is blinking red. This lack of reinvestment has meant we've got facility condition index numbers that are continuing to flash red and go through the roof. If we do nothing, we will be focused on an inventory that again is spread too thin, but is only barely making a safe place to operate, making it a safe place to operate for federal tenants and customer agencies, making sure that fire suppression systems are working. We're already struggling with elevator entrapments throughout the country, fire suppression systems that don't work, security guards that are being put on fire watch that have to walk through buildings because these systems are past their useful life, well past their useful life. So they're more expensive than they need to be. They're in the wrong configuration and there's too much space. If we target our limited resources and those collections to the areas of greatest need, the result can be an inventory of high performance federal buildings that well meets customer agency mission requirements, that can attract and retain the emerging generations of talent that right now, perhaps if they walk into a federal building, will turn their nose up and walk right back out because it's an asset that was built in a different era. You've got agencies that are, again, working to cure cancer, and in those very same buildings, there are built-in ashtrays in the walls. Like, the absurdity of this can't be overstated. So it's a real opportunity for us at the moment to capitalize on the trends that have accelerated post-pandemic, the trends that we saw pre-pandemic, and to really partner with customer agencies who know how to do this with GSA. The lease expirations that we saw pre-pandemic, many customer agencies were averaging already 15, 20%, 30% reductions when they went to renew their commercial lease space through GSA. That was pre-pandemic. So the question we have to ask ourselves now is, do agencies need more space, less space, or about the same amount of space than they had pre-pandemic? And I don't think it's not controversial at all to say that agencies likely need less space than they did. And all the data points in the GAO report and the CFO Act headquarters study, all the data points back it up. The Castle card system data that we see in the commercial sector says, in terms of the RTO, the return to office construct, that 50% of private industry is sort of back in offices. Commercial vacancy rates are approaching 21% right now. Net absorption continues to rise. We may see that turn the corner in this year, but we may not. All of that is to say that the realities of pre-pandemic, if we focus even just on that, there's an opportunity to save billions and billions of dollars, but it's going to take some initial upfront investment to allow us to mine that value. And that's the work that PBS has been on in partnership with our customer agencies, in partnership with OMB and the White House and their support of the legislative proposals, and some of the sort of discussions that we've been having with Congress on a technical assistance level. Privileged to be here today. Happy to answer any questions.
Here.
I appreciate I appreciate the end of your discussion on the portfolio planning strategy. I wanted to ask you about the GSA IG's work, because I'm sure you know, a couple of years ago, they issued a report that raised a number of questions, and it's also in their management performance challenges for 2024. It raised questions about the building assessment tool, the accuracy of the data, the decision lens and the criteria that are used for prioritization, some staffing issues, and also the ability of GSA to manage additional funds from the Federal Buildings Fund. So could you comment on that?
Super question. Thank you for that. So for starters, I do think that there's a good level of sort of the latest improvements in the building assessment tool, that tool that GSA uses to identify building facility conditions and deficiencies at the building or asset level. So there have been significant improvements. Some of those are reflected in the recent GAO report that came out in November on deferred maintenance and repair. What we know about the booked liabilities through the building assessment tool 5 and 10 years ago was it was an underrepresentation of the true liability count. That's still true today, but at an order of magnitude that's significantly less. So there have been great strides made in providing engineers on the ground with tools to utilize and resources to utilize the building assessment tool to reflect an accurate condition picture. I think a great view, though, into this challenge that PBS has and is not unique to PBS is the recent FFC report, which is to say that sort of building deterioration or deficiencies is only a portion of the equation, that reinvestment needs and renewal needs is the more accurate picture of the holding costs of assets. So what PBS tried to do in these stages of the process here was to say, based on a desktop level at a national office sort of view, here's the building deficiencies that we see in the system that help us to preliminarily rack and stack assets. When we went to this regional validation stage, we asked the building engineers, asset managers, and planning managers to scrub and validate those numbers and to say, if the federal government is going to stay in this asset for 10 years, what are the reinvestment needs that are going to be commensurate with that holding period? And that allowed us to apply a multiplier to the information that was in our building assessment tool to get a truer picture of what reinvestment needs are. So that's sort of a bridging solution to a more perfect world that we envision in the future with, and it sort of harkens back to some of Roger's discussion as well, about looking at our CMMS system, looking at the information that's in Maximo, looking at our building assessment tool, and figuring out how to make sure that those on a more recurring level take a little bit less manual care and feeding in order to stay fresh, so that this exercise isn't so manual every single year. The other thing that I'll say is that the ability to execute, which was the second part of your question, is something that PBS is very proud of on its minor repair and alterations program. So this is a significantly undercapitalized or underfunded portion of the inventory. It, on average, receives between $300 and $400 million annually for minor repairs and alterations. Those projects that under GSA's construct are below $3 million and change in terms of a dollar value level. At a $400 million level of investment annually, if we're just for purposes of discussion here, if we're looking at that program and that magnitude and looking at similar programs across government, PBS's track record in executing those dollars is one of the best, if not the best. PBS receives no year money. Those minor repair and alterations dollars are $400 million worth of funds that don't expire year over year. And we obligate it, we get it on contract 99.9% within a year. And 99.9 or 99.6% is as good as 100%. I don't think we would ever want to even approach that level of risk with a reconciliation on the books at the end of the year at a true 100%. So for purposes of discussion, even though it's know your dollars, we direct those dollars and get them on contract to projects that are identified through a prioritization scheme that we know are focused on meeting portfolio objectives. So they're focused on serviceability of assets and building systems, that they're in keeping with reducing liabilities and preserving revenue and reducing downtime on customer agencies. So that track record of executing the minor repair and alterations program is something that we want to build upon, knowing that there are needs that are well beyond that annual funding level of $4 billion. And I expect that future budget requests will be reflective of that, reflective of this sort of pivot towards new construction activities and towards taking care of the inventory that we own and that we have and reducing its size, using those dollars to reduce its size so that we're not spread too thin. In addition to receiving, I'll get right to it. In addition to receiving less funds than PBS needs in order to meet its mission and to reduce its backlog, the other negative consequence right now is that we're receiving funds for things that we didn't request. It's really exciting to build a new courthouse. There are a number of new courthouses that the GSA has received appropriations for that weren't part of its portfolio plan. Those were funded through congressionally directed funding, which is part of our reality. But then it speaks to this notion of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, Michael.
Question from Julia Tritz from the Department of Labor. I have, if GSA get full access to the FBF Federal Building Fund, but are unable to consolidate an excess, keeping in mind recent agency directives to increase on-site work, are they thinking about what additional monies would be needed to address the deferred maintenance and repair costs?
So if GSA doesn't receive access to the revenue and collections that it makes, the math never pencils out. And there's no other magic money that will help solve it. That's unfortunately the path that we're on right now is if we receive historic funding levels and the inability to consolidate, we will see assets that are truly run to failure, that don't support mission requirements and that are affecting health and life safety. We'll be more reliant on expensive leases that we shouldn't be in, and we'll be back on the high risk list for leasing that GAO publishes. I think that's the reality that we'll be in if lack of access to revenue isn't given. The wonderful thing though is the flip side of that is true. If access to revenue is ultimately granted, we can do all these wonderful things of making sure that the resultant facilities meet their portfolio objectives and support customer agency requirements.